Friends, very good to see you. Thank you for joining us. I keep saying good to see you, but of course I can't see you, but you can see us. But there we go. Good. It's always the old ones are the best, aren't they? Now, first thing, of course, always three things to do. Don't forget to click on the like. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to click on the share button and pass this on to other people. But we've got a very exciting development this week. Well, exciting, but also slightly sad. Unfortunately, James is not very well, so we have a guest on the video, Dr. Mark Bonnington from Durham. Mark, nice to see you.
Ian, very nice to see you. Greetings from, I was going to say from sunny Durham, but that's a lie. From dull Durham.
Cold Durham, probably. So we like coming to Durham for New Year because there's almost certain to be snow there as well. So, and there you go. The one thing that said wasn't going to happen has just happened. I've got a phone call. So it's all. It just shows it's all unrehearsed. Mark, tell us a bit about yourself. You're in Durham. What are you doing in Durham?
Well, I lead King's Church Durham, which is a Ethos-linked community church in the centre of Durham with a big student ministry. Came to Durham to teach New Testament at Cranmer Hall, which I did for 12 years. Taught New Testament at Leeds University for 3 years, and now I basically lead the church. Yeah, so that's me. And married to Ruth, who's a GP locally, and I hear, Ian, that's quite similar with you.
Yeah, it is actually, yes. We were born in the same month, the same year, both married doctors, both have 3 kids, but apart from that, and we both did PhDs in New Testament. So, but apart from that, nothing in common at all. Does sound as though you're quite busy, Mark.
I do several different things, but I'm not actually doing any teaching in Cranmer this year, which reduces my workload. And I'm sorry that James is ill, but I'm really glad to be able to join in with this. And to be talking about a parable that I realize I've never preached on before.
There we go. So this is what happens if this is what happens in your church that doesn't follow the lectionary, you see.
Well, I've always thought a bit like set words in prayers. You ought to follow a lectionary unless you can think of something better. And it's the same with set prayers. If you can
very provocative. That's good. Very provocative. No, this is the danger of having somebody on, from a non-Anglican background.
Well, we do preach through a gospel usually from Christmas to Easter, which always seems like a good time to preach through a gospel, but I haven't actually preached on this text, so that was great.
Okay.
I've got a sermon prepared now.
It is the Trinity 19, the last Sunday of the Trinity season, isn't it? Is that right?
I've got no idea.
I shouldn't, sorry, no idea. Okay. But the passage is...
I'm the wrong person to ask that. I thought Trinity was to do with 1s and 3s. I didn't know there were any 19s.
Yeah, quite. There we go. The passage is Luke 18, 9 to 14. So it's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Now, one of the things that we've been noticing in our conversations in the video is about particularly Lucan distinctives in this section. And we're kind of in the thick of it, aren't we? We're right in the middle of distinctive Lucan material. On a blog post I posted earlier in the week that there's a really helpful list from Mark Allen Powell's book about the distinctive material in Luke and distinctive Lucan parallels. And we think parables. We think there are probably around 14. People disagree on that. But we are in a thick of distinctive Lucan material on this sort of journey section, aren't we?
We are, and notice 1 or 2 distinctive Lucan phrases, like "I tell you" towards the end, and it's often regarded as part of a kind of series of example parables, which of course include the Good Samaritan, go and do likewise, and that sets up a series of example parables. This one perhaps, since it's the bad prayer of the Pharisee that's in view, go and not do it like the Pharisee and do it like the tax collector or the toll collector, however we should translate that phrase. Yeah.
Well, in a minute, I think we'll want to reflect on the function of the toll collector and the Pharisee as sort of icons of good and bad behavior and how we handle those. Just sticking with the Lucan dimension, there's a couple of things there, which is, I suppose, for even you might call ordinary readers, there is a question of saying, well, if we see something distinctively Lucan, how does that relate to the actual words and teaching of Jesus on the one hand? And I think, one of the things I explored on the blog is we get this yet again. We get this I think the second of 3 introductions where Luke tells us why Jesus is telling this parable, which doesn't happen in the other Gospels. In the other Gospels, it's assumed that we can see why Jesus is telling the parable and what the point is. But here we get this introduction. He told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. So The question, well, I suppose there's several questions here. One is, how does Luke know that that's why and to whom Jesus taught these things? And can we trust Luke's hermeneutical lens here, as it were?
Yeah, it's difficult not, I think, to read this parable in retrospect in the light of Pauline concerns about works and righteousness and so on. But one commentator I read, Friedrichsen, pointed out just how badly this would jar with Jesus' own Jewish first century context. And it's easy for us to see this in Pauline context. And that slight disjunction with Jewish context was a kind of indication that he thought this would clearly be authentic but shocking to people. As the introduction is that says he not only says this about these people, but he says it to these people. So this is quite a confrontational narrative.
Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, not.
Yeah, well, it's only said by people who haven't read the Gospels.
Oh, okay, fair enough. You just added in by talking about being shocking to its Jewish context. Again, one of the things that we then need to do in terms of reading this faithfully in its context is to say, this is Jesus the Jew being shocking to Jews, not Jesus the Christian, as it were, speaking against a Jewish context.
Yes, absolutely. And they're in the temple and it's thoroughly Jewish, both in what it expects to admire in the Pharisee, but that's challenged, and what it expects to disdain in the toll collector, which is challenged in the parable. And there's a sense in which it's a parable of reversing expectations.
And one of the things I observe in the way people, I mean, these parables of Jesus are little sort of extraordinary vignettes. They're beautiful little miniature examples of crafted narrative. And again, one of the things that I noticed in this was he introduces straight away two men went up into the temple. So often in Jesus' teaching, you have two figures that contrast one another. And even when we don't have two figures, even when we have multiple figures, they usually fall into two groups. So, for example, the parable of the pounds, where you have two who do the right thing and one who does the wrong thing. Or we had the story of the healing of those with the dreaded skin disease. I mean, pejoratively sometimes called the 10 lepers, where again they fall very clearly into two groups: the 9 who went away and the 1 who came back. And it seems to me that, I mean, in the context, as you say, of this sort of confrontational teaching, Jesus is so often saying, look, there are two ways. There isn't a middle compromise. It reminds me of that film from many years ago called The Fish Called Wanda, which I love, where Kevin Kline says, he's given two alternatives, and he says, what was the middle way? And of course, the answer is there isn't one. And so in that sense, that all of Jesus' teaching is beautifully little crafted little vignettes, is repeatedly saying, look, there's this way and there's this way, and there isn't a middle. You're confronted with this choice, with this decision.
Yes, and the echoes of the prodigal son seem very strong for me, where the main story, which follows, of course, the lost sheep in Luke 15 and the lost coin, you suddenly get two sons, one who is lost but repents and is found, and the older son who is indignant about it. And that whole chapter ends unresolved. Because we don't know what happens to the older son. But the clue to the whole parabolic chapter is the first couple of verses of Luke 15, which is Jesus is eating with those that with tax collectors and sinners that the religious authorities don't approve of. And when we get to the two sons, those are the two categories of people that appear in the parable in disguise, and it's left unresolved, whereas here it's resolved. But in a sense, that's it was a very close parallel, I think, with that story.
No, just in terms of these figures as sort of archetypes of two ways to be, and some of the things that you've already highlighted in terms of the context in which Jesus is teaching, and then Luke, like with Paul, relocating this into a less or a non-Jewish context. I mean, but one of the things that we've noticed in discussion over the weeks is you see some of the distinctive markers of Luke's teaching, Luke's recording of Jesus' teaching, reporting of Jesus' teaching, because he's translating it from a primarily Jewish and an exclusively Jewish context to a primarily Gentile one. And that raises some issues for us as well in terms of how do we view the tax collector? I mean, one of the classic expositions I've heard of this is for people to say, well, thank you, Lord, I'm not like that hypocritical Pharisee, which does rather undo the shock and the reversal, because, of course, we know, in a sense, we know that the Pharisees are baddies, don't we?
Yeah, I think it's much more complicated than that, of course. And Matthew 23 is the classic text. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, several times. And yet, in many ways, there are places there, including the little clip about tithing, where he commends the Pharisees, but then says, but you've missed the point. And so the Pharisees are not universally baddies, and they are an admired religious group with whom many don't associate, but I think this is meant to be a respected religious figure, essentially. And by contrast, the toll collector is a disdained religious figure, and we can all hear ourselves harboring potentially, that disdainful attitude towards those we don't approve of, or being smugly proud of ourselves. What's odd is I'm not sure I've ever heard a Christian put that in a prayer. I mean, actually to pray that seems a bit strong. I examine my heart and wonder whether that's my attitude. But,
there's a couple of tensions here, aren't there? Because, as you said, that the Pharisees were an admired religious group, and actually Jesus goes even further than that and says, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, then you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So there's, I think, a particularly Matthean perspective on righteousness. But also, we of course get this phrase, this proverbial phrase, someone who doesn't practice what they preach, which is lifted entirely from Jesus's criticism of the Pharisees. They don't practice what they preach. That's the problem, their practice. You should attend to what they teach. And of course, that then leads us into this question about, again, a common way of reading this parable is to say, oh, yes, it doesn't matter whether we fast and pray and do all these things that the Pharisee listed. It's all about being the tax collector, and we throw ourselves on the mercy of God, and Jesus hangs around with sinners, and so there's kind of what I would call an antinomian reading of this, which says that the Christian life, or what Jesus wants of us, isn't all this stuff about being religious and fasting and praying and so on. It is about simply throwing ourselves on the mercy of God. But again, we're doing something strange with the story and the context in which Jesus is teaching this.
Yeah, absolutely. And Matthew probably is clearest about this. He radicalizes Jesus' understanding of righteousness. Your righteousness has got to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. But I hear Christians occasionally loosely speaking about we're free from the law. And I think, well, if you read the Ten Commandments, you're really saying, we don't need to worry about those things, so we're free to, to covet and kill and lie and so on. It obviously doesn't mean that. No. And so the higher, the deeper righteousness involves doing stuff, but it is partly a matter of the heart. And that echoes very strongly this text, because it's the pride of the Pharisee and the humility of the toll collector that really is at the heart of the story, and the contrast between the long prayer and the short prayer nicely makes that point. The truly humble man doesn't have much to say before God.
I would get slightly distracted because I'm particularly interested in this thing about fasting twice a week, and actually in a different article which I can link. I've actually linked it in the blog post. I do explore this question of fasting, and a couple of things I found really interesting about this, which is that Luke, for some reason, Luke has a distinctive interest in fasting. And for example, when earlier in the gospel, there's the challenge from the disciples, interestingly, from the disciples of the Pharisees and the disciples of John the Baptist, which suggests that the Pharisees and John the Baptist aren't as far apart as we might sometimes think. Both groups say to Jesus' disciples, it says to Jesus, why do your disciples not fast often? Now, that's interesting because fasting often is a change from the way that fasting is depicted in the Old Testament. But there are other Second Temple Jewish parallels to that, which shows that this frequent fasting, this regular fasting, has become part of the spiritual discipline. And of course, what Jesus says is, well, the bridegroom's here, we're feasting now, but when the bridegroom is gone, they will fast. Now, it's curious to me that Christians seem to have forgotten that actually this Jewish practice of regular fasting, and here we find out it's twice a week. And then we find out from the Didache, the late 1st century, early 2nd century Christian document, which days they fast on. And the Didache says, don't be like the hypocrites, that's the Jews, who fast on a Monday and a Thursday, but instead you should fast on a Wednesday and a Friday. So you show you're not hypocritical, which is a very different approach to sort of spiritual disciplines than many have today. And of course, Wesley is well known for picking that up. He wouldn't ordain anybody who didn't fast 2 days a week. So maybe we need to, again, there's a complexity in reading this example of the Pharisee here, isn't there?
Yeah, there's the Christian attitude towards fasting. It's kind of complicated. I mean, there's only one fast in Jewish law. That's on the Day of Atonement. So everything else is more than Torah requires. The passage in the Didache is fascinating. I think don't be like the hypocrites. Just fast twice, but on different days. I mean, it's hilarious, quite apart from anything else. But of course, the Jewish discipline is to fast 2 days after the Sabbath and 2 days before the Sabbath, and the Christian discipline is to fast 2 days after Sunday and 2 days before Sunday. And what it's really about, that passage, I think, is not about fasting, but which you think is the holy day. And if you're a Christian, the holy day is a Sunday, not a Saturday. So it's a little kind of icon of attitudes towards the calendar, if you like, or the weekly cycle of worship.
And I think that unlocks some of the keys about this as well. I mean, again, on the fasting question, it seems to me that there's a sense in which we feast because of the goodness of this creation, but we fast in anticipation of the kingdom that is to come, which we've begun to experience, but is not yet fully realized. Now, just there's a fascinating little phrase here, and I'd be interested to know what you think about it, because commentators seem to disagree. I'm looking at the ESV contrasted with the NIV, and the ESV says the Pharisee standing by himself prayed, whereas other translations say the Pharisee standing prayed to himself. And there's a question about whether this phrase, praying to himself, is part of the sort of critique. His prayer isn't really to God. His prayer is sort of on a horizontal level, comparing himself. But I don't know if you had a view on that phrase.
The fact is that he addresses God in the prayer, which for me weighs quite strongly in the direction of saying he prays by himself. One commentator I read suggested that the reason it says this is because of concerns about ritual purity, being physically apart from the unclean as you go into the temple. And so I wonder here whether that's the concern. It would be typical of a ritually pure person to want to keep physically apart from other people, particularly when they're particularly concerned about ritual purity, as the Pharisees are.
Which is the root of the word. We think probably Pharisee means separated ones, distinctive ones. So, yeah. Now, we're coming into again, one of the things that I keep finding really striking about Jesus' teaching, and again, this perhaps highlights the question, how faithful is Luke being in terms of recording Jesus' teaching? But I mean, you pointed out to me in early conversation that there are strong parallels between the description of the toll collector and the description of the Pharisee, because we get parallels in terms of their description of the two different characters, don't we?
Yeah, each of them is in a particular place, and it's not very surprising to find a Pharisee in the temple and keeping away from others. It's rather odd to find a toll collector in the temple, and we might imply from that even his being there is some suggestion of openness to repentant hearts, as it were. Then we get a particular kind of posture, and the tax collector, the toll collector, beats his breast, and then we get a prayer in each case. There's a place, a posture, and a prayer, and the Pharisee.
Well, there's your 3 points for your sermon, then, isn't it?
That's the 3 points, your 3 P's, and it's all done now. And but the prayer of the Pharisee is long and self-praising, and the toll collector throws himself on the mercy of God. It's Psalm 51, have mercy on me, O Lord, and so on.
And again, interesting that it correlates again with things we find in other Gospels, Jesus teaching, and think in Matthew chapter 6 and the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, don't use lots of words. And he actually just, even in this short little episode, he actually characterizes that, the Pharisee has lots of words and the the toll collector has very few words. But again, Jesus' teaching, very carefully structured, extremely memorable, very vivid imagery. But again, a sort of a threefold structure. So often we find Jesus' teaching has this kind of threefold memorable structure, and both parallels and reversals. And again, one of the things you've mentioned to me is that you get again the language of reversal in the description, which then matches the teaching point about reversal in the conclusion.
Yeah, this is a surprising text, and we meet a Pharisee where we'd expect him to be, perhaps in the temple, and a toll collector somewhere where we wouldn't expect him to be, and they are introduced in that order. Whereas when we get to the end of the story, this one went away justified, not the other. And the order is reversed, and that represents the inversion, or perhaps reflects the inversion that happens in the story, of expectations that happens in the story.
So the way Jesus tells the story embodies the point at which the story is making.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah,
it is.
Well, you would even think he's an expert storyteller.
You might indeed. Now, just the last point in terms of content here is this fascinating language about justification. Now, Pauline studies is your particular area of interest in New Testament, isn't it, and research. So how do you see this Lucan language here relating to Pauline concerns? And in a sense, there's, I suppose, a question for me is Luke, as it were, closing the sort of interpretive gap between Jesus in a Jewish context, where he doesn't seem to use language of justification very much, and Paul, again, in a more Gentile context, where language of justification comes to the fore?
Yeah, interesting. And the verb for have mercy here is passive of the same verb that means in the active make atonement.
Yes,
and
yeah.
The three people that the Pharisee mentions are the greedy, the adikoi, the unrighteous. It's not translated in that way, but it's the same word root as
it is.
as
I hadn't noticed that. Yeah,
and
translated the unjust in the
and then the adulterous or something like that, and even this toll collector. Which perhaps suggests that the toll collector doesn't come into the same category as those other three, but nevertheless is a disdained person. This one goes away justified, takes us pretty close to Paul. He throws himself on the mercy of God, and that feels to me like a kind of halfway house between Paul and the more regular language of righteousness in the Gospels. But of course, the common element is the Jewish background, that this is the language that people use of how to be righteous, or when people are unrighteous, and Paul is drawing on that. And of course, the Gospels draw on that as well, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, and so on and so forth. Yeah,
and there's something then fundamental which takes us back to the whole point of the parable. It connects Jesus' conclusion actually does connect with Luke's introduction, which is that whereas other Jewish prayers that we have, thank God for what God has done and what God has made me. Here, the Pharisee is thanking God for what the Pharisee himself does and makes of himself. And the contrast there is about yes, our righteousness needs to exceed the Pharisees, but the question is, what's the source of that righteousness? Is it about what we've done, or is it about what God has formed in us?
Yeah, and lots of questions in Paul about what the role of faith is. That faith isn't a work; it's merely connecting us up to the grace of God that's on offer, and that's pretty much exactly what's going here in different language. He throws himself on the mercy of God, beating his breast, so there's real sincerity and emotion involved, and it's that humility before God that's being commended, which comes right out of the Psalms and the Proverbs, humbling ourselves before God. So I think what that does for me is point out that Paul is not so far from Jewish themes as we sometimes assume in the kind of, particularly in the Protestant tradition, I suppose.
And also the point you made at the very beginning about Jesus preaching in a way which is going to be shocking to his Jewish contemporaries, but actually entirely in line with the Old Testament testimony in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And ending up with, God, what is it? He the one who humbles himself, who exalts himself is humbled, and the one who humbles himself is exalted. That's a big biblical theme and a way of expressing a kind of theology of reversal.
Now, just to finish, Mark, you've talked about here Jesus, the master storyteller. What can we learn from this? What examples does he give us in this parable in terms of preaching on it?
Well, the first thing that struck me, and I mentioned this to you earlier, is he says this not about these people, but to these people. Right. And there's a couple of lessons in there, of course. You shouldn't be talking about people, you should be speaking to them. But doing this kind of confrontational thing is high cost and challenging. And Jesus is prepared to do that. And one of the lessons for the preacher is to ask the question, how can we challenge unhealthy attitudes in our congregation? I doubt whether we've got anybody in our congregation who prays, and of course in those days it meant praying out loud, who prays this in church. But nevertheless, when we hear things said that need to be challenged, we need to be courageous about how we challenge them. But doing it in the form of the story is a great way of doing it. And the parables of the lost in Luke 15 are a masterpiece of building up to a finale, as it were. And this parable does come with a resolution. I think the prodigal son does not come with a resolution. No, we left to read the rest of the gospel to discover what happens to the older brother. Yes. But here we aren't. There is a clear resolution. And sometimes I think that's necessary to bring people into land and say, this is the challenge. It is either or. There's not the kind of grey middle ground that you mentioned from a fish called Wanda earlier.
Just probably also worth remembering that we're not Jesus. So when we read this as challenges our congregations, we have to sit in the congregation as well and hear the challenging word for ourselves. Mark, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for stepping in. And we'd love to see you again sometime, although we do hope that James recovers and rejoins us as well. So.
We won't wish illness on James
no, we won't.
To that end, but thank you so much, Ian. God bless you.
Good. Thanks. And folks, don't forget to don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to click and to share, and there's a panel or something coming up here where you can subscribe as well. So, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.